Why does God allow weakness in your life? You ever feel weak? You ever feel, spiritually weak? You ever physically weak? Emotionally weak? Why do you think God allows that in our life? All right, so we can become strong. Okay, so He can be strong in us. Okay, good. To teach us what now? Say that again, Betty.
To teach us things that for not to be weak. Is that right?
Yeah, to teach us to depend on Him.
Right.
Yeah, okay, all right. Why else does God allow you? He's God, and you're His child, and He can easily compensate for your weakness, can't He? So why doesn't He do that for us? All right, so we grow closer to Him. All right, I think that's true. I think all these are true. Anything else you'd add to that list? Okay, our weakness does make us rely on Him. It causes us to realize that we're not as sufficient as we sometimes think we are, right? And you know, I think you would agree with this statement that when all is well, we just have this ability to not pursue God quite as hard, right? Any other reasons that you would list? Why does God allow weakness in our life? For His glory, you know. Because the way we respond to weakness is important, isn't it? And I think you'd agree with this statement. When we are weak, it is hard for us to focus on anything other than our weakness, right? And so weakness is an opportunity for the glory of God. It's also an opportunity for the devil to knock you about, isn't it? See, so our response is very, very important when it comes to this whole matter of weakness. Anything else you'd add to that list? Why God allows you to be weak? Anybody like weakness? Anybody like pain? No, if anybody said they did, I was going to schedule a counseling appointment for you. Well, I want to talk with you a little bit about this tonight. And let me tell you, we finished Hebrews before I left. We're going back to a survey of a book. Listen to the book we're going to survey next. If you've been a part of this whole survey thing for the last, 4 or 5 years we do. We occasionally take breaks. But I decided not to go ahead and introduce a new book to you to survey, because then we're going to be out for the next 4 weeks. And I thought if we do that, then we'll basically have to start all over. And so I'm just going to wait till September. But the book we're going to look at is Job. Job. You remember what God said about Job, don't you? This conversation with the devil. He says, have you observed my servant Job? And you remember what Job said back, Satan said back to God. He said, well, yeah, he serves you, but there's a reason. He only serves you because you've made his life so easy. And then we know that story, right? Then the floodgates literally of hell open up. And God gives the devil instructions. And we'll talk about this more next month. But, of course, one of the great insights for us is that the devil can't do anything that God doesn't allow, that God doesn't give him prayer. You remember what God told Satan? He said, okay, you have these boundaries, but you can't take his life. And so Job is really a study in how do you deal with weaknesses. And this coming Sunday in the new series I'm beginning in James, we're going to follow a similar line, because do you remember how the book of James starts off? There's greeting and introduction. We call it salutation. He starts off that way. But do you remember immediately where James goes? James, the half-brother of Jesus, by the way. Count it all joy, brothers and sisters, when you encounter various trials, meaning multifaceted trials, all kinds of trials, count it all joy. And then he refers to them as testings. They are the testings. They test us. They do, don't they? Trials are an expression of weakness. Well, Paul talked about that too, and that's what I want us to look at for a few minutes tonight out of 2 Corinthians chapter 12. So if you've got your Bible open there, 2 Corinthians chapter 12, I want to just read it, and then I want to come back and I want to show you some things about Paul's thorn in the flesh. Thorn in the flesh. I'll ask you a couple of questions in a minute, but let's just read the passage to get started here. Chapter 12, 2 Corinthians. I'll give you a second to find that. I'll give you a hint. It's on page 1593. But find that place and then follow along with me if you will. Paul says this, and I'll come back and give you the context of why he said, because this sounds kind of strange when you first read. He said, I must go on boasting, though there is nothing to be gained by it. I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. And then he says this, I know a man, by the way, he's talking about himself. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was called up to the third heaven. Whether in body or out of the body, I do not know, God knows. And I know that this man was called up into paradise. Whether in, again, the body or out of the body, I do not know, God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. On behalf of this man, I will boast. But on my own behalf, I will not boast except of my weakness. Though if I should wish to boast, I would not be a fool, for I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain from it, so that no one may think more of me than he sees in me or hears from me. Verse 7. So to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I'm strong. We've all read that before, haven't you? You've heard that. You've read that. Maybe studied it before. It's an interesting passage. Why does Paul spend so much time talking about boasting? Well, here's what's going on. The church at Corinth had been infiltrated by some heretics, really. And they were questioning. You'd have to go back to previous chapters, because Paul spends a lot of time in this book defending his ministry and having to substantiate himself to the Corinthians. I want you to understand, because what had happened were there's some false teachers that had infiltrated the church, and they were accusing Paul of teaching heresy. And then they were trying to substantiate their own credibility by bragging about how spiritual they were. And they were telling him, here's the sign that we've had revelations and we've had all these dreams and everything, and that makes us something special. So you got to listen to us because of the greatness of who we are. And so they're boasting about themselves, and they're boasting about their spirituality, and none of it is true, by the way. And Paul calls it all into question. But these people are pretty charming, and they're pretty persuasive, and so the people at Corinth are listening to them. And so what they do is they plant this seed of doubt in the church at Corinth that Paul can be trustworthy, is trustworthy, or can be relied upon when he teaches and when he writes his letters to them. In fact, Paul in this letter says, look, I want you to get this message. Even though I'm not with you there, I am coming to see you. And if you don't get it, he was accused of being weak and incapable. And by the way, he wasn't a good speaker. We know that. Paul said that himself. Excuse me. And but he said, I'll show you, because they said he won't address anything if he comes to you. And so Paul said, you better deal with this, or when I come, I'm going to deal with it. And then you'll see how bold I am or not. And so, but he's lovingly trying to persuade them to get the right message, not to put up with it. So, this is a kind of a, chapter 11 and 12 in particular, kind of a sarcasm, Joe. It's Paul saying, oh, okay, so we're going to boast about spirituality. That convinces you. If somebody boasts about their spirituality, then let me boast a little bit. If that's the game you want to play, or that's the game they want to play, let me boast about some things. And so that's why if you read chapter 11, you keep seeing this idea. And because you remember, Paul said, if I boast in anything, I will boast in the Lord Jesus Christ and Him alone. But here he's saying, okay, all right, that's what you need. Let me. If we're going to boast, let me boast a little bit. I can go down that road if that's what convinces you. And so now we move here to chapter 12, and he says, boasting. All right, let's talk about boasting. They're boasting and bragging about supposedly their visions and all that. He said, let me tell you about a man. He's that man. We know that from verse 7 if you go on, but he's that man. The scholars agreed. It's Paul. He's talking about himself. I know a man who's called up in the third heaven. And he saw things, he heard things that he can't talk about. Here's what that meant. He heard things that were so holy, he could not share them. He saw things so incredible, he could not describe them. And he did not have liberty from God to come down and say, let me tell you in detail what I saw. So what he does is he takes a big picture approach and say, you need to hear about visions and revelations. Let me tell you about it. I don't know whether it was a dream or if I was actually, it was an out-of-body experience. God knows that. That's not the issue. But you need something to substantiate my credibility. He said, let me tell you about something, about an experience. But that's all I'm going to tell you. What I saw and what I heard was so holy that I don't have liberty to share it with you. And probably what he meant too was, and if I did, you wouldn't get it. You wouldn't be able. Do you remember what Jesus told the disciples before he left them and ascended? He said, there are many more things I would like to tell you, but you're incapable of receiving them. You couldn't understand them. And so Paul basically says, look, I saw things I don't know how to describe. I saw things holy and righteous, and I don't have liberty to share them with you. All right? But if that's what you need to believe that I'm somebody you can trust, I'll play that game. But it's sarcasm when he's talking about boasting compared to their boasting. Does that make sense? So he's saying, if this is the game we're going to play, you need that. Let me just tell you about something. But he doesn't go into detail there. He just says he was taken up and he saw this holy and glorious stuff. And he said, but I refrain from telling you the details, because he says, what I'm trying to do while I'm being tongue-in-cheek about boasting, I'm also trying to not make you think more highly of me than you ought to. Because it's really all about God. And so he says, but I needed something to keep me from doing that. What was it, class? A thorn in the flesh. By the way, the word there in the Greek for thorn can mean thorn, or it can mean like a spike or something sharp with a point. And he says, so, to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh. Now, here's an interesting twist. He says, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. He says that twice. In other words, from getting puffed up and proud. And Paul even understood his own flesh. He understood you need to be wooed by some great vision or something. If I told you, it'd blow your mind. And it probably had blown Paul's mind, if you'll let me say it that way. And so he says, but God knows my flesh, and to keep me from getting proud about it and conceited about it, well, look what I've seen. Nobody else has seen what I've seen. And that's true. So he says, so God did something to keep me humble. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about Paul's thorn in the flesh. Why it was given to him. What is the purpose of weakness, or what is the purpose of thorns? Now, there aren't any rules about thorns except that the thorns have some purposes. But we don't know, for example, I don't know, have you ever felt like God has given you a thorn? We don't know. I mean, thorn may not be permanent. I think we've always thought that, well, if God gives me a thorn, that thorn will be something I have to live with the rest of my life. And it may be. It evidently was in Paul's case. But it may not be. It may be a thorn. It may be a seasonal thorn. It may be, and it may not always be physical. There's a great deal of speculation about what this thorn was. Have you ever heard some of the theories? There's some wild ones. Now, some people believe he was an epileptic, and that happened to him because of the vision on the Damascus Road when he got saved, and all of that, and that initiated that. I don't know how they get there. Some believe that it was the thorn that he's talking about here was the opposition that he faced, because he was opposed all the time within the church and outside of the church. And so there are some who say they think it was opposition. There are others who think it was an eye ailment, based on a statement Paul makes in Galatians when he says, see with what such large letters I write to you. So they're saying he must have had an eye ailment, so he couldn't see. There are just all kinds of there are 4 or 5 what they consider major possibilities. And I personally believe it was physical, and I think that's what most people believe. It was some kind of physical ailment that he had, but we don't know what it was. It could have been, somebody said, loneliness. I still interacted with some folks over the month of July, and I did some phone counseling, and with one man, I said, Pastor, he said, I'm so discouraged and I'm so depressed. And he said, I feel all alone. And he said, I've heard you talk about Paul's loneliness. He said, would you send me those scriptures? And so I sent him a couple of scriptures about Paul. And then I sent him one by David, where David was alone. And there are lots of examples of loneliness when you start looking for it in the scripture. And I sent him the encouraging part as well. Okay, so Paul says, at my first defense, no one stood with me. He sent word, he said, when you come to Rome, to the prison, bring the scriptures and bring my cloak. He was cold and alone in a prison cell. There's just so many things. You see that sometimes. Some people say it was loneliness for Paul, that he battled this loneliness, he battled opposition, or was it, all of these things. Well, the fact is, we don't really know. But because he said, it could be emotional, but because he said a thorn in the flesh, or a thorn, he could have said it, a thorn affecting the flesh, which could be opposition, all those things. But I think it's more specific to something physical that he battled. Now, here's the deal, because he says, there was given to me a thorn. Who gave him the thorn, class? God gave him the thorn. But then he elaborates and says what? A messenger of Satan. Now, isn't that strange? he says, to harass me in the ESV or to buffet me. In the Greek, the word has the idea of, it's like a pugilistic term, a boxing term. It's the idea of just being pounded in the face or the head. And he said, so the Lord gave this thorn to me, but it was a messenger of Satan to harass me. Now, what's going on with that? Do you have any idea what's going on with that? Because doesn't that seem kind of, well, how does God give something, then the devil, and then Paul says, but the devil is the one using this thing. By the way, God gave, that's in what we call the aorist tense in the Greek, which means it's just something that happened. God gave it to him. But then it says, a messenger of Satan to harass, that's in the present tense. That means God gave it, and the devil continues to use it. Now, does that make sense? Now, we know the devil he's a liar, he's a deceiver, he masquerades. We know all of that. And it's just like the devil to take something and capitalize on it, right? Now, here's the point that you don't forget because of Job, I mentioned earlier, Peter in the New Testament as well. But God allowed it. Now, maybe that'll give you a little bit of perspective sometimes when if you've got a thorn, if you're dealing with a thorn, that God may give it to you for the reasons I'm going to show you here in just a moment or two. But the devil will try to capitalize on it, and God may allow him to do so. All right? So God is still in control. Does that make sense? Because the devil can only do what God allows. So God gave it, but he allowed the devil to use it to harass Paul with. And it must have been something really tough. Because Paul, he asked 3 times, God, would you take it away? Anybody here believe Paul had prayer power? Yeah. But Paul says, God, take it away. Take it away. Take it away. Yes, ma'am.
Pastor, wanted to ask you something. What if God also wanted to know Paul's reaction to what was going on?
Well, just hang on because we're going to get there, okay? We're going to get there. But that's a good question. Was God looking to see what Paul's reaction might be? I think that's a part of it. But God is up to something. Now listen, this will help you if you've got a thorn right now and when you get a thorn, to know that God may allow the devil to beat you up with it. Because that's certainly what's going on here. Does that make sense? God gave it. God is in control. But the devil used it to beat on Paul with. And God allowed him to do that, or to be the messenger to help make this thorn useful. So there's the divine side of the thorn, and there's the satanic side of the thorn. And they're not actually in conflict in this case. They are under the control of God because God is doing something. Now, we don't know, as I said, what the thorn is. Why do you think Paul didn't tell us what the thorn is, class? Okay, because if Paul tells us the thorn for the next 2,000 years, every time somebody has what Paul had, they think, oh, it's a thorn. Right? That's the thorn. I got it. You know, and the fact is, I think Paul did not tell us because the principles that God is trying to teach us are more important than the actual thorn itself. Does that make sense? So, and by the way, every once in a while it's okay to ask God, is this a thorn? If you guys know, I have had a year of back trouble. I've never had back trouble. I mean, I've had occasional, you overdo it and your back hurts and you need Bengay. But I've never really had severe back trouble. And but for the last year, I've had real back trouble. It's weird. I can exercise, ride a stationary bike, and it doesn't give me any trouble. And by the way, thank God I can play golf and it won't give me any trouble. You would think, the back ailment, you swinging a golf club, that would, no problem. Actually, back feel better. You say, well, it loosens it up and all that stuff. But here's the thing. I could pick up something. Sometimes I could pick up just the thing that you'd think, well, that's pretty light. He's a big guy. He shouldn't have any trouble with that. And man, it would just, I could feel it and it would tweak my back. And you say, well, Pastor, if we press on it and everything, could you? No. And so it's been that way for a good while. And finally, I began to pray, God, if this is a thorn, help me get it. And if I've got to, and I asked him, God, would you touch my back? Would you heal my back? And he didn't. And so I began to say, God, if this is a thorn, sometimes it would be embarrassing. I mean, we've been out some places, the staff and stuff, and we've had events here where the staff starts kicking in, flipping tables and everything, and I'm just standing around looking, and I want to stand up and say, I'm not just looking because I'm the pastor and I don't do tables, but because I knew I couldn't, just the lifting itself. And so I just said, Lord, if this is a thorn that I've got to live with, finally I said, I'll do it. I'll do it. It's not debilitating. It's just there. Well, my back over the month of July is almost back. My back is back. And guess what I discovered? I think my doctor and I are in debate about this right now. By the way, if you got a thorn, doesn't mean it's not okay to try to fix it. Because if God doesn't want to fix, you won't get it fixed. But sometimes they're seasonal. Does that make sense? To make you depend on God. By the way, I know you just are dying to know what my problem is. I say that tongue in cheek. It looks like it's related to medication I've been taking. And you don't want to hear that whole long story, but I have a history and with these kinds of medications, and finally something dawned. I think the Lord put it in my mind, check into that. And so I've laid off that medication now since about the middle of July, and my back's almost 100% back. And so my doctor is debating with me about it, but he said, let's just stay on this course then, and we'll see. We'll see. So, but my point is in telling you that, and not so you'll know about my back, but so you'll know that I honestly said to God several months back, Lord, if this is a thorn, I accept that. I don't like it. I don't want it. It's tough when I lift my grandsons. But if this is a thorn, I'll live with this. There are a lot of other things that would be worse. So I believe that Paul didn't tell us what the thorn was because we would have eliminated some things that are thorns, and we'd have waited till we got whatever Paul's thing was. And if we don't have that, we don't have any thorns or weaknesses. So, that being said, here's what I want to wrap up with. I want to talk with you for just the remainder of our time about Paul's thorn of flesh. Why was it given to him? And first of all, I would say it was given to him to rebuke him. Now, I don't know if we like that word or not, but rebuke him so that he wouldn't become conceited. And so God says, I've got to keep you humble, and so this is the way I'm going to do it. I'm going to prevent you from becoming spiritually proud and spiritually arrogant. And so the thorn was actually a rebuke. Now, if you've got a thorn, or you've had a thorn, it's worth asking God, are you trying to rebuke me? And by the way, when God rebukes, it's a loving rebuke. And so He loves you, and He's saying, yeah, I've got to do this because If I don't, you'll get too big for your spiritual britches. And so to keep him from becoming conceited, he said, God gave me this thorn. It's a spiritual pride preventative so that we don't become proud of the spiritual things that God does in our life, so that we maintain the proper kind of humility. And that's really important for God to work in our life, is that we keep it in perspective, right? We keep things in perspective. And so He will rebuke us, and He will rebuke us at times with some kind of thorn, some kind of weakness that causes us to look to Him, to put our eyes upon Him. And so it was given as a rebuke to him. The second thing, or the second reason for Paul's thorn of flesh, it was given to refine him. He allowed Satan to beat on him a bit. And by the way, Peter says that the fiery trials, I'll be preaching about this in the weeks ahead, but Peter talks about the fiery trials are to refine us. And Paul's thorn was a means by which God used the weakness in his life to cause him to be completely dependent on God for the power he needed to serve and live faithfully for God. And the fact is that weakness is a requirement for the power of God to rest on us. And we all know that when things are always working well, we have a tendency not to look to God for power, strength. We just presume upon God. Well, things are going well. Israel used to think if everything was going well for them, it must mean God's favor was upon them. Do you know sometimes God lets things go well in you because He's trying to break your heart by His love and blessing? In Romans, Paul talked about that. The Christians in Romans were not walking faithfully with God. And Paul rebukes them. And you know what they say to him? Paul, look how good we have it. And Paul says in Romans, do you not know that you are despising the goodness of God? What Paul was saying to them, if you go on, is God has favored you because He loves you and He's trying to break your heart with His goodness. But if He doesn't there, guess what He'll bring? A thorn. I couldn't do it with that, so I'm going to bring a thorn in your life. So the thorn is to refine us. It is to turn our eyes more toward. And we all know none of us turn our eyes to God like we do when we got a thorn we're dealing with. Correct? Our prayer life changes. Our time in the Scripture changes. Our spiritual antennas go up, don't they? And we say, God, I'm listening. God, I'm listening. God, tell me. I'm waiting. I want to hear. I'll tell you. I'll share with not tonight. Time won't permit me. I'll share with you something that happened over the month of July, where God awakened me in the night. He does that sometimes. I believe that the Bible talked about how He spoke to David in the night watches. And I've asked Him several times, when I lay my head down, God, would you speak to me tonight? And there was a matter that I was dealing with, and it's a pretty serious matter. And so I had my plan. You ever put your plan in motion and then say, God, bless my plan? But I laid down and said, now God, if this isn't of you, I need to hear from you. And in the night, He woke me up. Listen, immediately, I looked at the clock. I know what time it was. I'll tell you the story somewhere down the road, maybe in a sermon in this series. But I looked at the clock, and boy, just like a voice out of the sky, whispered strongly in my heart and said, do not do what you are about to do. And then He said, you're forcing something that's not of me. Wasn't bad. Listen, it wasn't bad, so don't let your minds go wandering out there. It wasn't anything bad. There was nothing like that. But it was a step out of God's will about a matter that I was trying to force into God's will. Does that make sense? And man, I'm praying, God. And he wakes me up. He says, don't do it. You're forcing. Don't force this. And then he whispered in my heart, and this is what he said, this is a warning. And right then I said, okay, God, I won't do it. I will not do it. There's a lot more to that story. By the way, I will tell you this. So the next morning when we got up, Alice and I got up, she said, well, what are you going to do? I said, I'm not doing it. And I said, let me tell you what God said at 3:15 in the morning. He said, do not force this. This is not of me, and I am warning you. She said, wow. She said, he told you do not force this? I said, yeah. She said, She said, I was praying about it for you. And you know what I prayed? Lord, keep him from forcing this. I said, what a coincidence. We don't believe that, do you? Well, let me finish up. He'll speak. And when we have a thorn, we listen better, don't we? All right, more to say, but I'll go on, finish up. A third reason, last reason that the thorn was given to him was to remind him. It was to remind him of something he states when he says that when I am weak, that's when I'm strong. He says, so the Lord gave this thorn to me. The devil used it against me, but the reason God gave it is to remind me the thorn was ever present. By the way, maybe it was gone before Paul died. We don't know. But it wasn't then. And he said, so I rested in God. I said, God, so be it. Because I will boast in my weakness. I'm weak, but he is strong. And so he said, this thorn has been given to me to keep me humble, to rebuke me, right? It's been given to me to refine me, to make me more dependent on God. And it has been given to me as a constant reminder. Yeah, you're weak, so you've got to depend on me. You've got to depend on me. So, you got a thorn right now? Just might be this is what God's doing. And it's okay to ask him. Paul didn't say I shouldn't have asked him to take it away. But Paul did say, I asked him 3 times and he said no all 3 times. It took Paul's kind of like us in that sense. It took him 3 times before he got it. Oh, okay. No again? No again? I don't know. We probably had asked 10 times. You know. But he got it, and he got the message. So even when the thorn is difficult to bear and may be capitalized on by your enemy, the devil, recognize God's still in control. Learn, is he rebuking me from something, that is keeping something from worse from happening? Is he refining me? Look, trials, thorns are all there to refine us. And then, Lord, cause this to help me remember that I can't do any of this without your strength. I can't do any of this. Okay? So that's what I want to share with you tonight. Hope that's a bit of encouragement to you. Any thoughts or comments or questions before we go? Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Yeah, the near-death experiences where people say they were in the tunnel or going toward the light and all of that, and them coming back and talking about it. I don't really know. I don't know how to process that against what Paul said. They may have gotten a glimpse. I think it's possible. I was talking with one of our men yesterday who lost his mother while I was out in July, and he was telling me that right before she died, she started saying, look, I see the King. I see the King. and started talking about how beautiful it was. I think she saw the King. And she was talking about how beautiful it was. My dad did some of that before he died. He started talking about it's beautiful. It's just beautiful. So I don't know, Jared, where we've kind of put that in, this whole mix with what Paul's saying. By the way, there are some stories you never hear about. Did you know there are stories of people who died and went to hell? Those don't sell books. Nobody wants to read about that one. But I've got a book written by a doctor, Christian doctor.